Welcome to Altered Physiology, Mechanisms of Disease 1. This is week 5 on our lecture series related to stress and disease. This is episode 1. Let's get started. Here's our weekly learning objective to look at the mechanisms that explain the stress and disease relationships. How do we define stress? Well, it's really a person who experiences stress when there is a demand that exceeds an individual's coping abilities. This can result in a number of reactions, including disturbances that are related to your cognition, your emotions, and also your behaviors. Over time, it can adversely affect your well-being. So it's really this fine balancing scale between what is the demand and what is one's coping ability. Over time, though, as I mentioned, chronically, this can lead to certain types of illness and disease. Now, the fight or flight response was first coined by Walter B. Cannon, and we think about the fight or flight response in an acute situation where you are simply reacting to a stressful situation. We'll come back to that in a few moments. Next, it was Hans Sale that showed that physiological stress could result in physiological changes within other organ systems, thinking about the enlargement of your adrenal glands, decreases in lymphocyte levels, and the development of ulcers. And he concluded that physiological stress impairs our ability to resist future stressors. In fact, he was the one who termed the general stress response or the general adaptation syndrome. He perceived it to be primarily physiological. However, it was later determined that there are psychological factors surrounding these stressors as well. So it's not purely physiological, but stress can involve psychological factors as well, including reactive and anticipatory responses. So that is the historical background related to our understanding of stress. Now for some key terms. So very basically, when we think about a stressor, it's really a stimuli that triggers an alarm reaction. Not all events, though, however, are equally stressful to everyone. For example, some students might be able to write tests and exams with ease. Other students might find it highly stressful, to the point at which maybe they get sick from writing an exam. As I mentioned in the preceding slide, you can have physiological and more psychological or psychogenic kind of states. And these are general states of unpleasant arousal after life's events, and it can lead to numerous changes in the body. As I mentioned, it was Hans Sale that came up with this idea of a general adaptation syndrome. It is that non-specific response to stressors that we all have. There are both acute and chronic stages when we think about responding to stress. These stages have been further broken down into 3 main steps. The initial phase of trying to adapt to stress is that alarm phase, that fight or flight response. We can also think of it as being a period of hyperarousal or that acute stress response. It is that initial physiological reaction that occurs in response to a perceived threat to our survival. It might be a harmful event, it might be an attack, who knows, but it's perceived as a stress. Next, we have the second stage, which is the resistance or adaptation stage, and that's where our body is trying to cope with that particular stress. Lastly, we have the exhaustion stage, and this is what we also refer to as the process of allostasis. That's allostasis really means stability through change, being able to monitor the environment for adaptive responses. In particular, the brain will continuously monitor for future events and anticipate what is required from both the neuroendocrine and autonomic systems. What happens though is that you can have a period of overload in response to particular stressors. Allostatic overload is the overactivation of those adaptation systems. It can occur once again where there's an overactivation of your adaptive responses and can, make you more susceptible to disease. Here are some examples of that fight or flight, that initial general adaptation syndrome phase when, you really are in a stressful, acute stressful type of situation. Here are some key points though. Once again, summarizing the general adaptation syndrome. We have a stressor that kind of initiates this cascade of events. Not all events, though, are equally stressful to everyone. This is highly important to realize. We don't all respond to a stressor in the same way. However, it can lead to disturbances in our system, which leads to that kind of alarm and fight or flight response. After a period of time, though, our body is attempting to adapt or resist to that change. And so we can either cope with it or cope with it and perhaps recover, or it can also lead to the third phase of the general adaptation syndrome where we experience exhaustion and it can be pathogenic. It leads to the breakdown of our abilities of body, the ability of our body to really respond to the stress. And so that can lead to things like heart failure, kidney failure, compromised immune system. And that concludes this first episode.